Good morning, everybody. It is Saturday, August 5th. I said yesterday was August 5th. It was the 4th. And I'm sitting out in my camper this morning because I got to get some work done in here because I'm going on a trip this Friday over to Lake Lanier in Georgia. So I got a new mattress topper for this thing. I got to get it fixed up and ready and get my bed made and start getting it ready for the trip. I'll be leaving this Friday. I wanted to talk this morning about Russia. Russia. Uh, we live in interesting times, to say the least, and we live in times where so many Americans have a skewed view of the nation of Russia, and there are several reasons for this. We see Russia in America as bad or evil because we've always been taught or indoctrinated in that manner. And certainly today we have a president who presents Russia as being evil and an enemy. I remember the late Rush Limbaugh, who I really miss. He was a tremendous orator. He was really great at what he did. Probably the best ever, maybe at least since Paul Harvey. And I used to listen to Rush quite a bit. I didn't always agree with him, and I would certainly love to have engaged him at times, but of course that was almost nearly impossible. And even if you could get through, of course, you couldn't have a rational conversation with him because of, the constraints of radio and what have you. But anyway, that's beside the point. I remember one time Rush called Russia an enemy. And of course, he's right, they are. But should they be? Is Russia really bad? Or is Russia, as evangelicals refer to it, as the great Satan? Is Russia really bad? Or do we need to maybe revisit the issue and maybe look into some history about a nation that we've always seen as bad and as an evil? Why is that exactly? Now, we all know what Russia is doing in Ukraine, and we know what we're told, but we've got to stop for a minute and look more closely into where we get our information and where we get our facts. Now, there was a time in relatively recent history where I would agree that Russia was evil, because at one time, of course, Russia was not Russia, it was the Soviet Union. And it became this way after the Bolshevik Revolution, which I never studied in American public school, and I'll bet you didn't either, and if you did, it probably wasn't much. But to really understand Russia from an objective perspective and an accurate perspective, we have to kind of go back in time. Because historically, Russia was a largely Christian nation, specifically an Orthodox Christian nation. And it stayed this way up until the early 1900s. Russia was a monarchy, and it had a czar, and his name was Nicholas. And together with his family, Russia experienced, I don't know if you'd call it paradise, but they experienced really good times. And it was a free nation. The people were doing very well for themselves. But there was some turbulence and upheaval in Russia in the early 1900s, and the Tsar was murdered. He was assassinated, and the rebels not only assassinated him, but they also killed his wife and his children. And that is the roots of the revolution, which ushered in communism into Russia, which then morphed into the Soviet Union. And since its inception, of course, the Soviet Union was largely at odds with the United States, and this continued to increase as the years went on through the First and Second World Wars. We increasingly became hostile toward one another. I was listening last night to Mark Gruber, whose channel on YouTube I highly recommend. It's called America's Untold Stories. And Mark, who is Jewish, pointed out something that is really obvious to me at this point, and it is that Russia today has largely become what the United States was in the 1950s. That is to say, in the 1950s, we were a largely Christian nation with a booming economy. And the United States, he continued, has become what the Soviet Union was in the 1970s, which is a largely atheistic state, at least in its government, and largely its population anymore, and a police state with an overreaching government who spies on its citizens and persecutes political opponents literally at gunpoint. The former president, Donald Trump, of course, was recently indicted yet again, and I say gunpoint because, he wasn't arrested, but when he was indicted, he was brought to a courthouse, and there, he's literally surrounded by guns. If he's indicted in Fulton County, Georgia, the sheriff there has already said they'll be taking a mugshot of him. Well, when you are arrested, you are held at gunpoint. We're talking about a former president now. And that kind of transcends whether you're Democrat or Republican or whatever. If you can imagine a scenario where a former president of the United States is held literally at gunpoint, fingerprinted and mugshotted, that's what we're looking at. And that describes the Soviet Union of the 1970s. So we've kind of switched places. But the reason so many Americans, and I really hope you'll consider what I'm saying here, because so much of the anti-Russian sentiment is so deeply rooted in most Americans, I would say. The reason that is I consider twofold. Number one, among American evangelical fundamentalists, they are presented from birth with a warped eschatology, which is the study of end times. And a lot of their theology in eschatology emanates from what's called the Scofield Bible. And in the Scofield Bible, which is a Bible embraced by most evangelicals, Russia is presented in the margin notes, what have you, as the great Satan. And the great Satan is one day going to rise up and invade the chosen nation of Israel. Well, that's another issue altogether. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds, but Orthodox Christians understand, and many non-Orthodox Christians understand, that it is the church that is now the Israel of God, not some physical state that calls itself Israel. But like I said, that's another topic. But the Scofield Bible and its commentary, which has infested and infected so many evangelicals, presents Russia as evil, this great Satan, which is going to war against Israel one day. And so it is ingrained in their thinking of a Russia that is an evil and godless state. Secondly, Americans who have been indoctrinated in government education centers, otherwise known as public schools, have also been taught of Russia in this manner. You're hard pressed to find an American student who is taught the actual history of Russia. Now, I say this as an American. I'm a flag-waving American. I'm a patriot. I love my country. I don't love what's happened to my country, and I certainly don't love the government which is lording over us and spying on its citizens. This nation whose government has become morphed into a virtual police state anymore. That's how it was in the old Soviet Union. But I think it's time for us to rethink Russia as the bad guy, because maybe Russia isn't the bad guy. Now, I'm not saying they're not without problems and issues, and I'm not saying Vladimir Putin is without problems and issues. He's not a perfect man, not by any stretch of the imagination. But the old trope of Russia as evil needs to be revisited. Because if you look at things from the Russian perspective, it's not that way at all. As I've noted on a previous video, America has become so militarized, and America and NATO, which is basically America, has literally surrounded Russia on its borders with its ever-encroaching militaristic expansion, just like the Soviet Union's. And so now Russia is surrounded by NATO. How do you think they're supposed to respond to that? As our military continues to expand around the world, and look at what happens everywhere we go. Nothing but mayhem and destruction, unneeded destruction. Look at Iraq. Look at Serbia. Look at Libya. Look at Bosnia. Look at Afghanistan. And now we're doing it in Ukraine. Not officially, but we're there. Right on Russia's doorstep. And of course, on the Ukrainian issue, if we would actually look into the matter, we would understand why Russia did what they did, and we would understand that they were justified in doing what they were doing because they were provoked. It's not what we're told in the American media, not what we're told from the American government. But then again, all we hear from the American government and the American media is lies. So we could safely assume that if they tell us Russia is bad, then we can believe the opposite. Not that they're totally good, not that they're without faults. They are not. But by and large, everything we're told about Russia and everything we're told about this Ukrainian conflict is a lie. That's the safe place to be, is to just understand that whatever the government tells us and whatever the media tells us is a lie. If they tell us A, you need to believe B. And it's that simple, folks. Russia is not the great evil that we have always been taught. The great evil in this day and age exists. Its epicenter is in Washington, D.C. There's your great evil. There's your great evil. And other places, like they have outlets like Albany, New York, Sacramento, Trenton, New Jersey, and on and on and on it goes. Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. I think it's time we revisit the issue of Russia. I wish I could talk to every American, but I'm doing all I can. You can still love America. You can still be a flag-waving patriot. That's okay. It's not unpatriotic to question your government, and every founding father would agree with what I just said. That's the patriotic thing to do, to understand that we have been lied to. You know, Donald Trump was on to something when he's asked to this day about the Ukrainian war. Trump simply responds, I just want the war to stop. I just want the fighting to stop. He doesn't commit to military intervention in the region. He just wants the fighting to stop. The one thing I've always complimented Trump on is the fact he never got us into a shooting war. And this was the view of the early American founders, of early American presidents. No foreign entanglement, said our founding president. At the very least, the Russia-Ukrainian conflict is none of our business, and we should let them settle it and stay out of it. It's interesting how we are so infatuated, it seems, with the Ukrainian border, but we can't defend our own. Why are our troops on every other border that you can think of around the world, but they're not on the Rio Grande River? Is it fair to ask that? Why can't we defend the Mexican border, the American border on Mexico? Why is that less important than what's happening in Ukraine? Could it be, as I've previously noted, that Joe Biden is hiding something in Ukraine? Is there another reason he has us in Ukraine? Does he have interest in Ukraine that he doesn't want Russia to tamper with and possibly expose? Stop hating on Russia. Turn your venom and your ire toward Washington, D.C. Put your comments down below. I'd love to hear what you have to say. Thanks a lot. Talk to you tomorrow.